Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. When it comes down to it for this little video, I thought that I would reminisce over a little bit of boxing history. And for those of you all in all that don't know much about me, when I started watching boxing or getting invested into it, I started really getting into boxing in around 2010. But the problem was is that I didn't really watch a whole lot of modern boxing for a couple of years. I did nothing but overall really watch older clips of older fighters. And the main favorite fighters that I would watch would either be Muhammad Ali or that of Mike Tyson. So I really, all in all, did not even want to bother watching any other fighters because those are the main ones that usually entertain me. But eventually, when I did take a look at it, I said, you know what? I should probably watch some of the modern boxers, some of the greats of this time. And of course, the two best fighters and the two greatest fighters of my time, talking about the 2010s going onward, and of course, even a little bit earlier than that, were of course Mr. Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Manny Pacquiao. But in this video, when it comes down to it specifically, because of course Manny Pacquiao, he ended up retiring last year. I believe, of course, when he lost to Yordenis Ugas in that final fight of his career, he ended up deciding to hang up the gloves. And I do think that that was a very good decision because when I took a look at Manny Pacquiao in that fight, I mean, he still had a little bit of his athleticism there. He still had a little bit of his speed, a little bit of his power, but his legs looked completely gone. He was not able to move in any sort of direction like he used to be able to do. So I just think, all in all, that Manny Pacquiao, I think that it was a good call to hang up the gloves because I think that a peak prime Manny Pacquiao, I don't think that he would have ever lost to Yordenis Ugas. That's not me saying that, when it comes down to it, that Yordenis Ugas is not a very decently talented fighter. He is. He's very rough and tough, even though he has, a few losses in his career. But like I said, you can't always judge a fighter just because they have a few losses in their career. Because sometimes fighters, they end up being better a little bit later on. But it is what it is. But anyways, Manny Pacquiao, in my opinion, he really had one of the all-time great careers in boxing history. And if you've watched some of my past videos or whatever, and if you've heard me mention Manny Pacquiao, you probably already know where I somewhat rank him. But I thought that I would just talk about it a little bit more in this video. And we're going to review a video by Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation. And I believe at one point in time that I'm pretty sure that I reviewed this video already. But I thought that I would review it again, not only overall because I think that I can bring up different points overall in this video, but of course, I have more subscribers to the channel. So I thought that I would just talk about this video and also nip certain narratives in the bud as well. So we're going to be talking about this. But anyways, when I just take a look at this list all in all, this is apparently the Boxing Rec top 10 pound for pound list of all time. And I don't necessarily have a problem with the first 5 fighters that I see on this list. But then I take a look at the final 4. And I just take a look at these fighters and I say, you know what? How do these fighters really realistically make the top 10 pound for pound of all time? Because I take a look at Bernard Hopkins. And like I've already said about Bernard Hopkins, this is my opinion about Bernard Hopkins. I think Bernard was a great fighter for his day. But he was a great fighter for his day, in my opinion, the same way that Sugar Shane Mosley was, the same way that Juan Manuel Marquez was, the same way that Miguel Cotto was, and Oscar De La Hoya was. That's the level that he's on. And if you want to put Marco Antonio Barrera and Eric Morales in that conversation as well, you can put those guys in there as well. That's the level that Bernard Hopkins is on. I have no idea why this guy is ever ranked within the top 10 or top 20 pound for pound. He was never debatably the number 1 pound for pound fighter in the sport. And if you want to actually talk about a guy that not only lost several fights in his career, but usually lost the big ones, it would be Bernard Hopkins. I have no idea why so many people always take a look at Bernard Hopkins like he's a top 10 pound for pound fighter of all time. Because I don't truly think that he is. It just is what it is. And then you move on. You go to Joe Louis. Joe Louis has always gotten a lot of acclaim and a lot of praise. But in my opinion, I don't even think I would put him above Rocky Marciano. And of course, a lot of people would disagree. They take a look at Rocky Marciano and they say, oh, well, he was just hyped up. He was this big white hype when it came down to, when he defeated all those guys, they were older. Joe, I don't understand why so many people shit on Rocky Marciano and then they just give all this credit to Joe Louis. Because if you want to talk about some of the biggest wins in Joe Louis's career, go ahead and name me off some of his biggest wins at the current moment in time. What are they? Max Schmeling? Max Baer? they were not against overall the slick elite black fighters of the day. And actually, when he finally fought one of the elite black fighters of the day, he lost. It is what it is. And when Rocky Marciano, when he fought him, he knocked him out. All right, Rocky Marciano was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the day. He was undefeated. And he defeated overall the best of his day. Now, if you want to say Joe Louis was a bit older, whatever you want to say, but at the end of the day, You know, he was able to be undefeated in his career, and he was able to defeat some of the more talented heavyweights of his day. Now, at that time, they probably were naturally built more light heavyweights. But all I'm saying is this: Joe Louis, in my opinion, he can never be on a top 10 pound for pound list of all time. He just can't be. He can be, in my opinion, within that top 30 maybe. But when I just take a look at Joe Louis actually might be one of the more overrated heavyweights, in my opinion, in history. That's not to say that he was not highly skilled for the day. That's not to say that he was not decently great, because he was. But you can't be ranked above, in my opinion, some of these other guys that, in my opinion, were greater than you. It just is what it is. And then I take a look at Archie Moore. Archie Moore makes no goddamn sense, because Archie Moore was a person that lost every big fight in his career. When you talk about, him facing Muhammad Ali, Rocky Marciano, even Joe Louis, I think this dude lost to everybody. I don't know how he makes the top 10 pound for pound list. And then you have Oscar De La Hoya. Don't get me wrong, Oscar De La Hoya, great fighter, but like I said, he's in that same ranking as Miguel Cotto, Bernard Hopkins, Juan Manuel Marquez, Sugar Shane Mosley. That's where he is. I have no idea how Oscar De La Hoya sometimes on certain boxing pound for pound lists, how he makes the top 10 pound for pound of all time. How are you going to debate that? I mean, the biggest wins of his career, and we really take a look at it, Ike Corte was the big one. I thought, the Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker is the biggest one in his career, and a lot of people personally thought he lost that fight. But whatever, I'll give it to him. But he also lost several big fights in his career. He lost both Shane Mosley fights, He did end up getting the decision over Felix Tito Trinidad, even if you want to debate that was controversial. He lost to Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Manny Pacquiao. It's like, dude, how does this guy always make the top 10 list? I have no idea how. But it just is what it is. But we're going to be talking about that in this video, and let's just get into it.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So I got some news that's about to really hurt the racist fans' feelings right now. Floyd Mayweather has just been rated as the greatest fighter of all time. He was already rated as the greatest fighter of this era before this, but now he's been rated as the greatest fighter of all time by BoxRec.com. Now, it makes sense, and I'm going to break it down, but what doesn't make sense is they have Manny Pacquiao at number 2. That is completely ridiculous. But we're going to talk about that later on in this video.
Well, just to talk about it real quick, I actually don't think that it is completely ridiculous. Now, would I necessarily rank Manny Pacquiao as high as number 2 on my list definitively? Maybe not, but Manny Pacquiao was an all-time great fighter. When I take a look at Manny Pacquiao, when you just take a look at his accomplishments and even his skill set, Manny Pacquiao, in my opinion, is debatably up there with anyone. So I guess that's pretty much spoiling where I already rank him. He's in my top 10 pound for pound of all time, no doubt about it. Manny Pacquiao, when you talk about how many first ballot Hall of Famers, how many champions, how many really great fighters that he defeated, I mean, Manny Pacquiao has to be up there with anyone.
Let's talk about Floyd Mayweather first. Those 2 clips that I played with Oscar De La Hoya talking. The first clip, as you guys seen, that was back in 2010. That was at the post-fight press conference right after Floyd Mayweather dominated Sugar Shane Mosley. Now, it's important to note that at the time that Floyd Mayweather fought Shane Mosley, fans were accusing Floyd of ducking Shane Mosley. Shane was considered the number 1 welterweight in the world. It was kind of like Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence, where there was always a debate on who the best welterweight was. Not only was...
Well, I don't think that it's really appropriate necessarily to compare it to that. I understand your point, Dante, but I would compare it more maybe to a Mike Tyson versus Evander Holyfield. And the reason why I say that is because, it was still looked at as a big fight, but most people knew more than likely that Floyd was going to beat him. But people just took a look at it and said, wow, can this guy really give a challenge? It's an all-time great fight that we've always wanted to see, and, let's see what happens. But Floyd was a decent favorite in that fight, because Shane Mosley at that time already suffered several losses in his career. Now, the reason why he was ranked as the number 1 welterweight is because he was able to defeat, of course, the Mexican fighter Antonio Margarito when it came down to it. And, of course, he was not able to beat Shane Mosley in that fight because he got caught with them hand wraps right before the fight when it came down to it, and his power was never the same after that, even though he still was a decent puncher, but nowhere near the same, amount of power that he used to have, But when it came down to it, like I said, the reason why he was ranked number 1 is because at the time he had defeated current top 10 pound for pound fighter Miguel Cotto. And then, of course, Shane Mosley went on to defeat Antonio Margarito, I believe at an older age, maybe even like 38 years old. And, of course, that's when he was ranked as the number 1 welterweight in the world. So I don't think it was really an Errol Spence Jr. Terrence Bud Crawford situation, because there was already a multitude of blueprints on how to defeat Shane Mosley. Shane Mosley already had several losses in his career. Now, that doesn't mean that it was not an all time great win. It was, in my opinion. Floyd deserves a lot of credit. But like I said, Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford, to me, that's more of a Sugar Ray Leonard, Tommy Hearns situation, where people took a look at those fighters and it was a real 50-50 fight, and they were both undefeated, and people said, wow, who really is going to win this fight?
Shane Mosley, considered the #1 best welterweight in the world at the time, he was also on the pound for pound list. He was rated as pound for pound one of the best fighters in the world, top 10. Floyd Mayweather completely dominated him. Now, what makes what Oscar De La Hoya said about Floyd Mayweather so impactful, so deep, is the fact you seldomly hear boxers admit that their rival is the greatest fighter of all time. Joe Frazier, he never said this about Ali. Neither did Sonny Liston. Neither did George Foreman. Right?
Well, actually, after a while, I do believe that Joe Frazier and George Foreman, especially, after a while, they agreed that Muhammad Ali, I believe, was the best. But it depends on the era.
Right?
But usually, athletes or fighters, they won't admit overall that someone is the greatest of all time, even until like maybe even 20 years later.
Tommy Hearns, Hagler, Duran, they never said this about Sugar Ray Leonard. So it's a
Well, in my opinion, Sugar Ray Leonard was the greatest fighter of the four kings. But no, they're not going to admit that, because all those fighters, they look at each other basically on the same level or slightly above one another. Because if you talk about Tommy Hearns, he was able to defeat Roberto Duran. He had he got knocked out by Marvin Hagler. But when you talk about him versus Sugar Ray Leonard, Tommy Hearns is looking at Sugar Ray Leonard and he's saying, "Listen, dude, I was beating you in that first fight. You ended up getting lucky. You ended up getting a knockout. But then in the second fight, I thought that I clearly won." And I dominated you. Not really dominated, but Tommy Hearns, in my opinion, clearly should have edged it out. It just is what it is. So, on top of that, Marvin Hagler, when he was around, he defeated Roberto Duran and Tommy Hearns. He thought that he beat Sugar Ray Leonard, even though I would disagree. And Roberto Duran, of course, had that win over, Sugar Ray Leonard. He's the only one out of them that has a definitive win over Sugar Ray Leonard. So, like I said, all those guys, they look at each other basically on a similar level. They were never going to admit that Sugar Ray Leonard was a greater fighter than them, because they don't truly believe that.
hell of an endorsement when someone like Oscar De La Hoya says it. And remember, he said this over 10 years ago, and then I played the clip of him saying it again recently. And that's with him not even liking Floyd Mayweather personally. That's when you know he's being honest. Of course, in that clip, I don't know if you guys noticed, but he was a little tipsy, so the truth was really coming out when he was talking about.
Oscar is always tipsy. Oscar is always up to something to where something is fucking going on. Oscar drinks a lot. You can tell. You can tell that somewhat with his career that he's a little bit depressed with how it went. And I think that he takes a look at it and I think he says, damn, if I would have done things a little bit differently, I would not have, lost some of those bigger fights in my career. Now, some of you may disagree with me, but when I take a look at Oscar De La Hoya, when he reminisces over his career, when he always says, well, I always fought the best, I always fought the best. When a fighter usually says that, what do they say? Well, or what are they trying to say? I fought the best of my day. That's why I have several losses on my record. That's why when Oscar De La Hoya takes a look at Canelo Alvarez, he's been going after him so personally. Because Oscar De La Hoya, like I said, I think that he envies Canelo Alvarez a little bit, because I think he knows that Canelo more than likely has already been counted over Oscar De La Hoya and Marquez and some of those fighters. And they would be correct, because Canelo is greater than those fighters. Because, like I said, Oscar De La Hoya, in my opinion, he's in that same realm with Miguel Cotto and Shane Mosley. Fighters that were A-grade fighters, first ballot Hall of Fame fighters, but they could not just beat the creme de la creme usually, a fighter that was debatably #1 pound for pound. Now, Oscar De La Hoya, of course, was able to defeat, Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, in a fight that a lot of people personally thought he lost, including me. But when it comes down, whatever, Oscar De La Hoya ended up getting it at the end of the day, but he also lost several other big fights in his career, like against Floyd Mayweather Jr., like against Sugar Shane Mosley, like against a couple of others.
Floyd Mayweather has the most impressive resume in boxing history in terms of dominance, in terms of dealing with adversity, dealing with so many different styles. I mean, if you look at all of the greatest fighters of all time, look at all the styles that Floyd Mayweather had to defeat. From a Manny Pacquiao, to a Canelo Alvarez, to a Ricky Hatton, to a Zab Judah, to a Shane Mosley, right? And I'm only naming a few. to a rough and rugged Mark.
I agree. Floyd Mayweather Jr. was one of the all-time great fighters, no doubt about it. And if you were to debate him as the greatest in history, I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with it at all. Floyd Mayweather Jr. was a highly skilled fighter. He defeated pretty much almost every great fighter of his day. It's no problem. Floyd was an all-time great talent, whether you like him or not.
Maidana, and even a Castillo. Let's not forget Oscar De La Hoya, who had height and tremendous hand speed. Not to mention, he was like 20.
Well, yes, but Oscar De La Hoya was not the same Oscar De La Hoya that was in the very early 2000s or in the late 90s. So let's be a little bit real here, Dante, because we all know what you like to say about certain fighters that you don't like, especially with the Canelo Alvarez. But you notice that he won't say that about the fighters that he likes. But don't get me wrong, Floyd does deserve a great amount of credit for beating even that version of Oscar De La Hoya. It's just that that version of Oscar De La Hoya, I don't think was really at the prime or peak of his career, but it still was a very big win.
Pounds bigger than Floyd Mayweather the night of the fight as well. Speaking of fighters being bigger than Floyd, a lot of his opponents were much bigger than him.
No, actually, no, not a lot of opponents were much bigger than Floyd. They were just slightly bigger. At least some of them were. But of course, if you're an all-time great fighter, you're expected overall to perform on that level, just like Manny Pacquiao, just like some of Roberto Duran, yada, 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 yada. That's what, in my opinion, separates them from the rest of the pack or other fighters that I may not be mentioning. But when it comes down to it, let me just say this, because certain fans overall or certain people that, they talk about this debate or this argument, or they talk about Floyd and Pacquiao's career, and they always take a look at Floyd and they say, man, every fight that he fought, they were all almost so much bigger. That's not really that true. There was a few fighters in his career that were about 20 pounds bigger. Like if you want to talk about Canelo Alvarez and Oscar De La Hoya and Victor Ortiz. But besides those fighters, I can't necessarily remember any fighter that would have been about 20 pounds bigger. Some people say Miguel Cotto, but I highly doubt it because Cotto never usually rehydrated anything, besides 160. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that, but I highly doubt it. I never seen Cotto. Like I said, Cotto, in terms of build and reach and height, and even stature, he was a natural welterweight. He just had extraordinary power. So, it just is what it is. Not only that, but extraordinary skills. So, like I said, a lot of people, they'll say, oh, well, Floyd, the majority of fighters that he fought were so much bigger than him. Well, some of them were decently bigger than him, but a lot of the times, especially when he was facing people at welterweight, they were maybe about 13 pounds bigger than him usually. So, to this narrative that Floyd usually fought fighters that on average were like 20 pounds bigger, that's not true. That never has been true. Sugar Shane Mosley was not 20 pounds bigger than Floyd. Neither was Miguel Cotto. Neither was Ricky Hatton. Neither was Juan Manuel Marquez. Neither was Manny Pacquiao. None of those fighters, all in all, were 20 pounds bigger than him. It just is what it is. And on top of that, Floyd Mayweather Jr. was gifted with a very great reach for his size. Now, does that mean trying to degrade Floyd Mayweather Jr.? Absolutely not. All-time great fighter. But like I said, Floyd Mayweather Jr. also was given a reach overall to handle somewhat of the bigger weight divisions. But you know what? Let me give Floyd Mayweather Jr. some extra credit here because he could have been another Tommy Hearns, to where even though he was gifted with that decent height and reach, for his size, for those weight divisions, he could have been another fighter like Tommy Hearns who could have got knocked out by Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, and a couple of other fighters in his career. He could have been on the level of another Tommy Hearns, but instead he separated himself from that pack.
Most impressive wins. Floyd Mayweather has beat more fighters on the pound-for-pound list than any other fighter. I mean, just to understand how impressive that is, imagine if there was a fighter today that had beat 4 to 6 fighters on the current pound-for-pound list today, no matter what your pound-for-pound list is. Just imagine what you would be saying about a fighter that was able to accomplish something like that. I told you guys in one of my recent videos, people always try to say, oh, Canelo, he's just doing all the same things that Floyd Mayweather did. And I explained to you, actually, he's doing the opposite. Canelo Alvarez.
No, he's not doing the opposite, but we all know that you're going to try to push that narrative because Canelo does not have the complexion for your protection. So it is what it is. No, Canelo is not doing the opposite. He is fighting a lot of A-grade champions out there. Like I said, this bullshit narrative that Dante and especially a lot of these other people try to put about Canelo Alvarez, it's just so stupid. Like, you're really trying to tell me that Canelo, every single time he faces a champion, it's he's just cherry picking and, he's picking very carefully to make sure they're out their worst performance. Like, come on, dude. Really? Like Billy Joe Saunders, who was an undefeated champion, he was really coming off of his worst performance. Callum Smith, from what I heard, he wasn't very good in the John Ryder fight, but I don't know. I've never watched it. But either way, Callum Smith still was a very decent fighter. Caleb Plant was coming off of a series of very dominant wins when it came down to it. Arislani Lara was one of the top contenders. Danny Jacobs was coming off of a win over Sergey Derevyanchenko, which was a somewhat expected tough fight. But Danny Jacobs still clearly won the fight. He was able to defeat Gennady Golovkin, coming off of two very decent wins. Once again, I don't mean to beat a dead horse here when it comes on it, but I think I've already mentioned this point a multitude of times, but I always just got to bring it up because I could not believe how dumb this point actually was. This person actually brought up this point to me and said, "Oh well, man, don't fall into the hype with Canelo, man. You're just getting stuck in the honeypot because you're just falling into the hype because when I really researched it, Canelo really fought the weakest links overall at this time. Just all sort of stupid bullshit." And he said, he fought Gennady Golovkin overall. When he had a tough fight with Danny Jacobs. And I was just looking at it, and it's like, if you actually know the context of that situation, it's like, well, no shit. Because Gennady Golovkin, of course he was going to have a tough fight with Danny Jacobs. That was the biggest fight of his career up until that point overall, until, the Canelo Alvarez fight. That's like, once again, that's like me bringing up the point all in all, well, don't fall into the hype before he made the junior, man. Don't fall into the hype before he made the junior. He wasn't as great as many people try to say that he is. It's just all bullshit because, he fought Canelo off of his worst performance when he had a competitive fight with Austin Trout. If you know the context, Canelo and Austin Trout was a tough 50-50 fight at the time because they were both undefeated champions. So it's like, no shit. It's like, who would actually be dumb enough to actually come up with a point like that? Like, I was actually surprised that this person had the gall and the balls to actually overall even come up with that point because it's just so stupid. It's like, how do you not see how dumb you actually fucking look with that point? It just makes no sense. That would be like me complaining all in all, like, I don't even know how to compare that. That'd be like, if I was talking about football or tennis or something. That's like me saying, you know what, man, don't fall into the hype with Novak Djokovic, when it comes down to it, because he only beat Rafael Nadal coming off of his worst performance because, he had a very tough competitive fight, or match with Dominic Thiem or Daniel Medvedev. No shit. Because the higher you move up in class, the harder the fights are going to be. That's just common sense. Like, who actually would be dumb enough overall to actually bring up a point like that? Apparently this guy. But it just is what it is.
Fighting guys coming off of their worst performances. Floyd Mayweather was always fighting someone coming off of their biggest win. And when I talked about this...
That's not true. Oscar De La Hoya was not coming off of the biggest victory of his career. Zab Judah was not coming off of the biggest victory of his career. And I believe that there maybe even was a couple of others. But like I said, for those of us that have to put things into context, like I said, we have to overall really put things into context here. There's a difference between like when Terrence Crawford fought Amir Khan and Kell Brook when they were completely washed up, and when Canelo Alvarez, when he fought Sergey Kovalev, or Mayweather fought Oscar De La Hoya. And sure, they maybe were not the same exact fighters, but they still had a very, they still had a very decent point in their career. They still could have been debatably championship caliber fighters. So we have to give those guys credit for those wins. Now, once again, if you're talking about Terrence Crawford when he defeated Kell Brook, when he was complete mincemeat, not a champion and a fighter that already had 2 knockout losses and was completely done, that's a different situation. But that's not what overall this situation was.
In a previous video, some of you guys said, well, hey, what about Zab Judah? He didn't fight him coming off of his biggest win. And that's true, he didn't. Zab was the only one.
No, Zab was not the only one. Oscar De La Hoya was another one, and there maybe even was a couple more. But like I said, that's no reason to discredit Floyd Mayweather Jr. But like I said, you can clearly tell that Dante, he has his own narrative to play out. And that's why I review his videos, because Dante is so full of shit 99% of the time.
That situation, Floyd Mayweather and Zab Judah, they were scheduled to fight next, assuming Zab Judah got past Carlos Baldomir. At the time, Mayweather versus Zab Judah was like the biggest fight. It was one of the biggest fights in the entire sport. So what happened? Zab Judah, he loses to Carlos Baldomir. Floyd Mayweather, he ends up fighting against Zab Judah. But who did he fight after he beat Zab Judah? The guy that beat Carlos Baldomir. Once again, a guy coming off of the biggest win of his career. Right? Now that Floyd Mayweather...
Right, but then you take, why are you trying to overall make the point overall that Canelo Alvarez is allegedly doing the complete opposite? Like, you try to act like Canelo is literally facing people coming off of losses. Like, come on, man. Now, of course, Avni Yildirim, that's a different situation. But besides Avni Yildirim, who else is Canelo facing that's coming off of losses? Was Gennady Golovkin not a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter when he beat him? Was Danny Jacobs not at the best point in his career when he beat him? And same with a couple of others. Like, come on, man. Like I said, Dante always tries to make this stupid point about Canelo. Oh man, don't fall into the hype because he just faces fighters coming off the worst performances. Bullshit. I've seen fighters overall face fighters coming off their worst performances, and Canelo has not done that. All right, it is what it is.
He went after the loser, and he didn't fight the guy that beat Zab Judah, then that would be a bad look when it comes to Floyd. But he didn't do that. He did what you're supposed to do. He beat this man, and then he beat the man that beat him. Now listen, guys, when it comes to conversations of who's greater out of Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao, those conversations are really not up for debate. The only reason why people even talk about this is because of the racism that exists in the sport of boxing. Because if
Well, listen, what I'll say is this when it comes down to it. I don't completely disagree with what Dante's Boxing Nation just said, but what I will say is this. There is going to be a certain amount of people that do debate Manny Pacquiao over Floyd, not only because there's a lot of scrutinism on Floyd, but Manny Pacquiao, he is an 8-weight division champion. Do I think that he's necessarily on the same level as Floyd Mayweather Jr.? No. I think when you take a look at it, especially under a magnifying glass, when you take a look at them both closely, I don't think there's any doubt. I think that Floyd Mayweather Jr. has to be remembered as the greater fighter of the two. It just is what it is. Not only was he undefeated, not only did he defeat Manny Pacquiao, but I thought that he was more skilled for his day. So I don't necessarily have a problem with that. To me, comparing Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather Jr., they're not a huge separation, but there's a clear overall advantage. And to me, it's kind of like comparing Sugar Ray Leonard or Marvin Hagler. Both, great fighters, and some would even debate Marvin Hagler over Sugar Ray Leonard, but at the end of the day, I just can't do that. Sugar Ray Leonard was like, what, a 4-weight division champion, even for the day, and on top of that, Sugar Ray Leonard, maybe he was a 3-weight division champion, I don't know, but it was one of those two, but Sugar Ray Leonard, when it came down to it, on top of that, he was able to defeat Marvin Hagler, and overall, he was just more dominant for the day. So, they're both close, in my opinion, but at the end of the day, Sugar Ray Leonard, he would be above Marvin. It just is what it is. It's kind of like comparing Peyton Manning and Joe Montana, to where, they're somewhat close, but when you take a look under the, the microscope, and you take a look under the magnifying glass, you can clearly see overall the differences where Joe Montana, in my opinion, he'd be above Peyton Manning.
racism didn't exist, no one would be trying to compare the loser to the winner. There's a reason why the whole world wanted to watch this.
Well, I somewhat understand your point, Dante, but I actually can't completely agree with that. And the reason why that is because, like I said, there's a lot of people that would even compare Tommy Hearns, for example, to Sugar Ray Leonard. I would not personally do that, but, it is what it is.
Spike.
I mean, shit, there's a lot of people that try to compare Bernard Hopkins to Joe Kawasaki. You'd be one of those people. The 90% of people out there would say that Bernard Hopkins, all in all, is debatably the greatest middleweight of all time. I would not say that, but it is what it is. Or I'm not going to say 90% of people say that, but there's a lot of people overall that say that. I don't even think Bernard Hopkins, personally, in my opinion, just in terms of greatness, was greater than Joe Kawasaki.
Because this fight was going to determine who.
And I know I'm going to get some people on here, oh, well, Joe Kawasaki only beat him when he was 43 years old. He beat him when he was 43 years old. He also beat him when he was a top 4, top 5 pound-for-pound fighter. Go ahead and take a look where Bernard Hopkins was ranked on the pound-for-pound list. Both Joe Kawasaki and Bernard Hopkins were both top 5 pound-for-pound fighters in the world, and Joe Kawasaki ended up getting the clear victory over him, in my opinion, 8 rounds to 4. So this 43-year-old, of age bullshit, that only works, all in all, if you're not at a good point in your career.
The best fighter of.
Or, for Manny Pacquiao, like when he lost to Yordenis Ugas, someone who clearly didn't look the same when it came down to it. And on top of that, he was coming off of a 2-year layoff. Now, that's something with a substance. But if you're talking about the Bernard Hopkins versus Joe Kawasaki fight, no, you can't really argue that because Bernard Hopkins was one of the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters in the world. He was coming off of victories over Kelly Pavlik, who was undefeated, all right, and the Ring Magazine middleweight champion. He was coming off of wins over, Winky Wright, who's another all-time great fighter in many people's eyes, and he was coming off of a win over the Ring Magazine light heavyweight champion, Antonio Tarver. So Bernard obviously was good enough to beat those fighters. He just wasn't able to beat the fighter on the next level overall, who was a 50-50 matchup, him versus Joe Kawasaki. So it always makes me laugh when people say, oh, well, can you, Bernard, he was able to go life and death with Joe Kawasaki. Can you imagine what he was able to do when he was younger? He wouldn't have done shit. Because Bernard Hopkins was at the best point in his career. He wouldn't have done shit. Bernard would have not been able to beat anyone overall that was similar in size, and that was a 50-50 fight. You know how I know that? Because he never was able to win any of the 50-50 fights in his career when the fighter was near his own same size. Never. Name me one 50-50 fight that he won overall against a fighter that is going to be a future first ballot Hall of Famer when it comes down to it, that he actually won that was similar in size. None of them. Biggest win of his career is over Felix Tito Trinidad. The rest of them, when it comes down to it, how many of those middleweights that he defeated? How many of those guys can we really say are all-time great? None of them. Just is what it is, besides Felix Tito Trinidad. Now, of course, he ended up getting the win over Oscar De La Hoya, but Oscar was heavily outsized against him. And on top of that, he already had a couple losses at that point in time in his career anyway. So it is what it is. You know, like I said, Bernard Hopkins, he probably has to be the most overrated fighter of all time in boxing history. Not even a close second.
This era. Even Freddie Roach admitted that if Floyd Mayweather beats Manny Pacquiao, Floyd is considered the best of this era, hands down. Matter of fact, let me play the clip. Now, Freddie, obviously, you believe Manny Pacquiao is going to win the fight. I'm just saying, hypothetically, something that's not supposed to happen actually occurs that night, and Floyd wins the fight decisively. Two questions. If Manny Pacquiao wins the fight, where do you rate him as an all-time great? If Mayweather wins the fight, same question.
I think it's a good win for Mayweather if he wins the fight. Pacquiao is, again, I think, if you want to go with the history of boxing, you go with all the boxers out there that from ever. Are you talking about the best of ever or the best of just his era? I think he might be the best fighter for his era. Yes.
Like top 20, top 15, top 5?
Best fighter of his era, right?
Mayweather, in my opinion, has to be ranked within the top 10, just like Manny Pacquiao. No doubt about it. Both of those fighters, in my opinion, all-time great fighters. You know, big draws when it comes down to it. You know, and like I said, we can try to discredit whoever we want to here, but both Floyd and Manny Pacquiao, all-time great fighters.
Yeah, because he's undefeated, very good.
Okay, so that was an interview I did with Freddie Roach at his gym right before the Mayweather versus Pacquiao fight. Do you guys notice when I asked him the question, if Manny Pacquiao wins or if Floyd Mayweather wins, where do you rate them? Do you guys notice he never even mentioned Manny Pacquiao's name? He only talked about Floyd Mayweather. In fact, he was talking as if Floyd had already beat Manny Pacquiao. He was saying Floyd Mayweather is definitely the best fighter of this era. I think Freddie Roach always felt deep down Floyd Mayweather was going to be this fighter, Manny Pacquiao. I remember when this fight was first
Could be true.
signed, the first thing Freddie Roach said is this is going to be a very difficult fight. It's going to be a difficult fight to win. Floyd Mayweather doesn't make too many mistakes. This is exactly what he said. So while Freddie Roach is damn near panicking, you know, Floyd Sr. and Floyd Mayweather, they're talking with all the confidence in the world. And the fight played out just like that, with the most confident fighter winning. So you racists out there, boy, that's really got to hurt your feelings when you hear even Manny Pacquiao's trainer at...
I love it when Dante's vaccination always calls other people racist. It's like R. Kelly or Kevin Spacey if they were to come out and basically say, you know, you rapists out there, or, you know, you child molesters. Come on, dude. It's like, you know, are you really anyone to cast stones? Come on, man.
Admitting that Floyd Mayweather is better. You can't argue against this man's trainer telling you that Floyd Mayweather is better. But you know what? Just to beat a dead horse, let me really break this down to where even a racist can understand it. So you race fans, I want you guys to imagine the man you hate right now, Floyd Mayweather, right? Imagine if Floyd Mayweather had already been knocked out 2 times. I'm talking about before he became a superstar. He had already been knocked out twice. He fights Juan Manuel Marquez 4 times and struck.
Well, what I'll say overall is this, because if you're trying to, you know, and they try to bring up the same point with Vasyl Lomachenko, like I said, to me, you know, the early losses in Manny Pacquiao's career, especially if we're talking about the 2 knockout losses he had to like Filipino fighters or Vietnamese fighters very early on in his career, that's when Manny Pacquiao was a very wild and very untamed. Like he was like one of those Mustangs over that you would see in the wild overall that, you know, needs to be broken down all in all and basically needs to be tamed. And it's going to take a lot of work because Manny Pacquiao, he's always been a little bit of a wild fighter. Even though I thought at his best he was highly still skilled, He had excellent angles. He had, decent feet. He moved decently well, moved in and out very well. But Manny Pacquiao, he always has had a little bit of a wild side within him. So, Manny Pacquiao, sometimes he would get a little bit crazy. So the early fights in his career, especially that he would lose there, I mean, you can bring those up if you want to. But the big question is about Manny Pacquiao is, did he win the bigger fights of his career? And he won almost every single one of them.
Every single time he fights him. And in the fourth fight, Floyd gets knocked out cold by Juan Manuel Marquez. Then Manny Pacquiao comes along and he completely dominates Marquez in one fight. Then after the world has been asking for this Mayweather versus Pacquiao fight for so many years, they finally get in the ring and Manny Pacquiao beats Floyd Mayweather. Race fans, be honest in your heart right now. Regardless of how many accomplishments Floyd Mayweather has, would you be calling Floyd Mayweather greater than Manny Pacquiao in that scenario?
Well, the Floyd Mayweather Jr. haters, just like the Manny Pacquiao haters, they're not going to call them the greatest of all time, no matter what they do. So it is what it is. But I understand your point, Dante. I don't think that is necessarily the worst point. But what I will also state is this. There's going to be a certain amount of people that would rank Manny Pacquiao above Floyd just because he is an 8-weight division champion. And in terms of champions, it's somewhat similar. Now, do I think that Floyd maybe beat certain champions at a better point in their career at times? Yeah, sure. So that's why I would put Floyd above Manny Pacquiao. But at the end of the day, there still is people that will put Marvin Hagler or maybe even Tommy Hearns in the same category as a Sugar Ray Leonard. Would I would? No, absolutely not. But there are certain people overall that would do that.
And we already know the answer. I ran into a brother out here in Thailand who's actually a fighter, and he's a fan of my channel. And we started talking boxing, and he was telling me how people are saying that Manny Pacquiao is actually greater than Floyd Mayweather. And I asked him the same scenario that I asked you guys. I said, if Floyd Mayweather had been knocked out 3 times, lost to Manny Pacquiao, got knocked out by Marquez, would there be anybody saying that Floyd Mayweather was the greatest fighter of all time or even greater than the guy he lost to, Manny Pacquiao? I asked this guy this question, and he said no. And this guy was on some coon shit, and he still said no.
Like I said, it's very interesting all in all, and I'm not saying that there's not certain guys out there that maybe do not try to appease the other demographics. But anytime you do not agree with what new media says, and if you tend to be of the black demographic, what do they call you? They call you an Uncle Tom. They call you a shill. They call you a sellout. They'll call you a coon. So I just find that very interesting. They did the same thing with Andre Ward when Andre Ward was basically saying that he did not think that Deontay Wilder got cheated and that he believes that Tyson Fury was going to defeat Deontay Wilder.
Like I said, man, if we're being realistic, it's not even up for debate. People only have these conversations because of the racism that exists.
Well, if you take a look at it on the surface, it's a debate. But when you really overall know what you're talking about and view the context, no, in my opinion, Floyd Mayweather Jr. clearly has to be the greater fighter than Manny Pacquiao. It just is what it is. Just like Sugar Ray Leonard, for his time, in my opinion, has to be the greatest fighter of his day. Even though many people, of course, would debate Roberto Duran, or Tommy Hearns or Marvin Hagler.
The sport of boxing. I tell you guys all the time, boxing is based on race, nationality, and pride, in that order. And we see this play out every day in the sport of boxing. Do you ever notice whenever people try to give Floyd Mayweather backhand compliments by calling him the greatest defensive fighter of all time, do you guys notice they never talk about who's the best offensive fighter of all time? They don't do it because they made up this ridiculous term to kind of discredit Floyd Mayweather. If you think about it,
I would somewhat agree with that, because Floyd Mayweather Jr., when you talk about his offensive skill set, he was an extremely offensively great fighter as well. You cannot be just a purely defensive fighter and win pretty much every big fight in your career. Well, he did win every big fight in his career. Because Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, he was a fighter, in my opinion, that was a little bit more defensive than Floyd. Now, in terms of great defense, I would say all in all that, probably on a very similar level. But when it comes down to it, all in all, like I said, Floyd Mayweather Jr., in my opinion, he has to be a league above Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker because he was more offensively talented, in my opinion, than what Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker was. It was no offense against Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, but when I just take a look at his resume, I mean, besides the Chavez Sr. fight, when it comes down to it, how many fighters can I really take a look on that list and say, wow, he beat an all-time great fighter there? I mean, there's just not a whole lot. I thought that he personally beat Oscar De La Hoya, but a big problem with some of Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker and some of his bigger fights as well is that he wouldn't throw as much as what he needed to. So it is what it is. Floyd, he always found a way to win. That's the credit I'll give him.
Floyd Mayweather is also...
So certain people, they try to compare Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker and Floyd Mayweather Jr. in the same league. In my opinion, they can't be. Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker was an all-time great fighter, but he's a league, in my opinion, not only below Floyd Mayweather Jr., he's also a league below Manny Pacquiao.
the best offensive fighter.
Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker cannot make my top 10 of all time.
Because we're talking about numbers. Who is the most accurate puncher in the sport of boxing? It's Floyd Mayweather. Who lands the highest percentage of punches? It's Floyd Mayweather.
Well, just because I know someone has the highest accuracy doesn't necessarily mean that they're always the greatest offensive fighter. But, well, of course, let me say this. You can say that that's a part of it. But the fact that on top of that, not only does he have the accuracy, but that he debatably lands the most amount of punches, or connect percentage all in all on other fighters, that's a great support to your argument.
How do you think Floyd Mayweather outlanded every single fighter that he has faced? Because you can't win fights with defense alone. These are code words they only use for black fighters. How come they never call Willie Pep the best defensive fighter of all time? How come they never call Lomachenko one of the greatest defensive fighters of all time?
Well, Willie Pep, when it comes down to it, you would have a real good point there. Because Willie Pep, of course, was known as the fighter that went around without even throwing a punch. You would have a great point there. But Vasily Lomachenko, he's a little bit different. Because Vasily Lomachenko, what he really is actually for this day, he's like a smaller version of Manny Pacquiao. That's what he is, in my opinion. Now, in my opinion, I would say that Vasily Lomachenko's feet were a little bit better than what Manny Pacquiao's was. But, of course, Manny Pacquiao, in my opinion, of course, he has to be counted as a greater fighter than what Vasily Lomachenko was. Because Vasily, of course, just doesn't have anywhere near the accomplishments of a Manny Pacquiao. That's who Vasily Lomachenko actually kind of reminds me of. He tries to be a more calculated and more disciplined version of Manny Pacquiao. When I take a look at him, he always comes in usually with his head off center. When it comes down to it, and he's a southpaw, he's going to try to go in there and break you down. That's what he's mainly going to try to do. So Vasily actually at his best, he's not usually, it's not that he's not defensively responsible, because he is very defensively responsible. But besides the Teofimo Lopez performance where he was highly defensive because I think he was a little bit too afraid to go in there because he was afraid of getting knocked out, Vasily Lomachenko, we all know what his main game plan is going to be. He's going to try to go in there, break you down, and get the knockout, or at least break you down to the point overall to where you're going to submit.
You know what time it is. But like I said, numbers don't lie. For these racists, saying that Floyd Mayweather is the best defensive fighter in the world, it helps ease the pain when they have to admit that this man is the best.
I don't completely disagree with that, and I've heard you overall have to use some certain term words, all in all, to ease the pain with Canelo or Tyson Fury.
Now let's talk about Manny Pacquiao being listed number 2 as the greatest fighter of all time? So you mean to tell me all this time we've been saying that Sugar Ray Robinson and Muhammad Ali is the greatest of all time, and then just like that, a man that actually loses to Floyd Mayweather, he's supposed to be greater than all of them? The logic makes no sense. See, this is what you guys have to understand.
I get your point, but like I said, Manny Pacquiao, when you talk about the big fights that he won in his career and the first ballot Hall of Famers that he won in his career, of course, he did not win the Floyd Mayweather Jr. fight, but there's many top 10 fighters of all time that you can debate did not win the biggest fight of their career, like Roberto Duran or Marvin Hagler or even Chavez. Even Chavez, I don't think that he beat Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker. But when it comes down to it, all those fighters were all-time great fighters. They would debatably be within my top 10 pound for pound of all time. Manny Pacquiao is clearly within my top 10 pound for pound of all time. Sure, he didn't get the Floyd Mayweather Jr. win, but he was able to defeat multiple all-time great fighters: Miguel Cotto, Eric Morales, Marco Antonio Barrera, Juan Manuel Marquez, Ricky Hatton, I suppose, even though, of course, he got knocked out by Floyd not too long, ago. But, even Shane Mosley, if you want to count him, because, sure, he was coming off of a loss to Floyd Mayweather Jr., but, he still probably would have been ranked as one of the top guys in the world at that point. So even if you want to give him credit for that, and a couple of others that, I'm not even mentioning, Timothy Bradley, of course, who's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer, Keith Thurman. Manny Pacquiao beat so many great fighters during his career.
Understand. What makes fighters like Floyd Mayweather, Sugar Ray Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Pernell Whitaker, Sugar Ray Leonard, what really made these fighters greats? I mean, top of the level, elite greats. What really made them greats was the fact that they won the most important fights of their career. Manny Pacquiao is definitely a great fighter, but let's be honest. What are the two biggest fights of his career? The two biggest fights of his career was Floyd Mayweather and Juan Manuel Marquez. Manny Pacquiao, he fought Marquez 4 times. Muhammad Ali, he fought Joe Frazier 3 times. That is a serious rivalry. And Manny Pacquiao, he lost that rivalry against Marquez.
No, he didn't lose the rivalry to Marquez. And this is a part of the reason why I wanted to review this video, because certain people I don't know that try to spread this narrative, they have no idea what the hell they're talking about. Now, you notice that Dante, when it comes to Andre Ward versus Sergey Kovalev, he'll never mention this shit, because a lot of people thought that Sergey Kovalev won the first fight against Andre Ward. But is Andre Ward not an all-time great fighter because of that? No, of course not. We still have to count that. So, like I said, with certain fighters, he'll basically state overall. Like a lot of people thought Mayweather lost to Jose Luis Castillo in both fights. There's a lot of people that believe that. There's certain people that believe that Floyd Mayweather Jr. lost to Marcos Maidana in the first fight. Does that mean that it's true? No, it doesn't necessarily mean that. So does that mean that, when I take a look at Floyd, well, you know what? I'm not going to count Floyd on the same level because I thought personally that he lost that rivalry when it came down to it. We have to overall count, if the fight was at least somewhat competitive, as long as it was not a clear robbery, like the Timothy Bradley versus Manny Pacquiao first fight when it comes down to it, or the Yaroslav Lara versus Paul Williams fight, or Sweet Pea Pernell Whitaker versus Chavez Sr. fight, as long as it's not a complete robbery like that, and as long as the fight is super duper close, I'm talking about 7 rounds to 5 or 6-6 going either way, you can't really claim that he lost that rivalry. And when you take a look at Manny Pacquiao versus Marquez, I actually personally watched those recent fights because of this recently, and you know what I scored them? The first fight, all in all, I actually have not watched in a really long time, so I can't tell you there. But the second fight I scored for Manny Pacquiao, I believe that I ended up scoring it 114-113 for Manny Pacquiao. It was 6-6, but the problem was that the knockdown was the difference in my opinion, because Marquez ended up getting knocked down in the third round. But Manny Pacquiao, in my opinion, clearly just edged it out. And in the third fight, I had a 7 rounds to 5. Marquez, I thought, was winning the first half of the fight, but the final 5 rounds, I gave all to Manny Pacquiao. The problem was with Juan Manuel Marquez, in my opinion, even though he's an all-time great fighter in his own right, he just did not throw enough, in my opinion, in those fights. It just is what it is. So he just lost those fights. So no, Manny Pacquiao did not lose that rivalry. He won the rivalry. Because out of the 4 fights, 1 was a draw. Manny Pacquiao got 2 wins. Marquez got 1 win. And really, to be quite honest with you, if Manny Pacquiao, if he would have been a little bit more careful in that 4th fight, just like he was overall in the other couple of fights that he was with Marquez in the 2nd and 3rd fight, he probably would have knocked Marquez out.
Knocked out by this man.
Or all in all, at least beat him.
Now, granted, I will say that Manny Pacquiao, he definitely has some big wins, though. I would say his 2 biggest wins with no controversy.
Yes, and the Marquez when it comes down to the, but like I said, you can't necessarily say all in all, you can't just degrade someone's record because it's like, oh, well, this was controversial, unless it was super duper 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 controversial, like a complete robbery. To me, it just can't count. It is what it is. That this is the same shit that he always tries to do with Canelo Alvarez in recent times. He always tries to say, oh, well, Canelo, he really lost to Gennady Golovkin and Yaroslav Lara fights. Listen, at the end of the day, both of those fights were competitive. And Canelo got him at the end of the day. So you have to count those as all-time great wins for Canelo. It just is what it is. Now, like I said, if it's a Sweet Pea Pernell Whitaker versus Chavez Jr. Chavez Sr. situation, that's a different situation. But when you take a look at the Pacquiao versus Marquez fights, they were so close and competitive that they could have potentially won either way. So if the judges score for Manny Pacquiao at the end of the day, hey, it is what it is.
Percy was his trilogy that he won against Eric Morales and his win over Marco Antonio Barrera. Those, to me, are
the biggest wins overall, if you're a logical and objective person, and Lord knows that Dante's Boxing Nation is not. The biggest wins of his career, in my opinion, and I'm talking about Manny Pacquiao, of course, biggest wins in his career, of course, are either over Juan Manuel Marquez or Miguel Cotto, because in my opinion, Miguel Cotto and Juan Manuel Marquez, they're on the same level. And those boys were at their peak.
Biggest 2 wins of his career. But unfortunately for Manny Pacquiao, he lost the most important fight of his career, and that was the fight of the century against Floyd Mayweather. That's what it was billed, the fight of the century.
That's true. He did lose the biggest fight of his career against Floyd Mayweather Jr., but like I said, I'm not going to hold that against him too often. Because, like I said, does that mean that he's still not a top 10 fighter of all time because of that? Marvin Hagler lost the biggest fight of his career. Tommy Hearns lost the biggest fights of his career, period. Bernard Hopkins lost almost every big fight in his career. So, like I said, I can't hold that against Manny Pacquiao too often. Now, of course, some of those fighters I would not put on the same Manny Pacquiao level. But Manny Pacquiao, in my opinion, he was not able to be considered, in my opinion, the best of his generation because he lost to Floyd Mayweather Jr. But at the end of the day, he would be second greatest. Second fiddle. That's not too bad, considering all the all-time great fighters that were this generation.
Can you imagine the pressure that was on Manny Pacquiao going into that fight, right? You can't be greater than fighters like, once again, Sugar Ray Robinson, Sugar Ray Leonard, and all the other names I mentioned, because those fighters, they actually won the most important fights of their career. Sugar Ray Leonard.
Right, but so did Manny Pacquiao. The only thing that you can claim all in all is that maybe he's not quite on the Floyd Mayweather Jr. or Sugar Ray Leonard level. Maybe if you wanted to debate Muhammad Ali or Rocky Marciano up there as well, I would understand, because those are all fighters that were clearly the best of their day. The only thing I'll say about Manny Pacquiao is that, of course, he was one of the best of his day, but he was not first. He did not come in first place. So, like I said, he came in second place, and there's nothing wrong with that. But like I said, no, he can't be counted over Floyd Mayweather Jr. But when you talk about Manny Pacquiao, considering him, even if you want to compare him to Sugar Ray Leonard, he's debatably in that conversation, in my opinion. But, if you compare him to Roberto Duran, Marvin Hagler, even Carlos Monsoon, or, Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., if you compare him to any of those fighters, you can debate him over any of those fighters. Even Muhammad Ali, debatably. Even though if you wanted to debate Muhammad Ali over him because Muhammad Ali was clearly the greatest heavyweight of the era, you could do that if you wanted to. But at the end of the day, like I said, Manny Pacquiao, in my opinion, is debatably in that conversation,
He beat Duran in the trilogy. He beat Hagler. He beat Hearns. He beat Wilfredo Benitez. Ali beat Frazier, Sonny Liston, George Foreman, right? Pernell Whitaker. He won the most important fights of his career.
Which ones? Which ones in particular? Because I thought that he beat Chavez Sr., but it was debatable who won that between him and that Oscar De La Hoya fight. Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, listen, I love Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, all-time great fighter. I don't think I can put him on the same level as Manny Pacquiao. I don't even know Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, besides that Chavez Sr. fight, I don't know if he ever even defeated a fighter that was on the Miguel Cotto level. It is what it is, because when you really take a look at Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker's resume, I mean, maybe this is just because I didn't really get to watch him a whole lot, I don't know, but when I just take a look at his resume, when I take a look at his record, besides Chavez Sr. and Oscar De La Hoya, there's not a lot of fighters that I really recognized on that resume. It is what it is. And on top of that, he also lost to Felix Tito Trinidad. So, Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, great fighter, all-time great fighter. But he has to be a tier below. He has to be within that top 15, top 20.
Ray Ward, Bernard Hopkins, all of these guys.
Now you hear that he brings up Andre Ward when it comes down. He brings up Andre Ward. But and listen, Andre Ward, all-time great fighter. He's not greater than Manny Pacquiao. I can't necessarily have him over Manny Pacquiao, because the greatest fighter of his, like I said, Andre Ward, in my opinion, he's on that same level with Joe Calzaghe and Bernard Hopkins, in my opinion. So that's where he is. And it's not that Andre Ward was not an all-time great fighter for his day. He was. But I don't know if I would say that any of the fighters that he defeated, in my opinion, were as skilled as some of the other fighters that I see Manny Pacquiao defeat. Like, for example, in my opinion, Miguel Cotto at his peak, he's a decent amount more skilled than any of the fighters that Andre Ward ever fought. Just is what it is. And you always notice that, like I said, Dante always tries to bring up this bullshit point with Canelo and some other fighters, like, oh, Canelo, he only faces these weak Caucasian fighters. Andre Ward made a living off of beating the shit out of Caucasian fighters. He beat nothing but Caucasian fighters, like Carl Frost and Mikhail Kessler and Sergey Kovalev, and Arthur Abraham. The only black fighter that I can really remember him ever beating was Chad Dawson. And that was a fantastic win, don't get me wrong. Like I said, there's a reason why Andre Ward, in my opinion, is the first ballot Hall of Famer. All-time great fighter, probably within my top 50 of all time. But I don't quite know if I can put him in the top 10 or top 20.
Won the most important fights of their career.
Because even Joe Calzaghe had that win over Bernard Hopkins, who, in my opinion, he'd be on that same level as some of the top 30, top 40 fighters of all time. But Andre Ward was a very special fighter as well. If you were going to debate him in that same category with Joe Calzaghe, I would not have a problem with that.
So you can't even put Manny Pacquiao in the top 10. I mean, it would be generous to put him at the...
Of course you have to put him in the top 10. Who the hell else are you going to put him in the top 10? Like I said, name me 10 fighters off the top of your head that you really have over Manny Pacquiao. I'm sorry, but I can't put Andre Ward over Manny Pacquiao. Andre Ward, not that he was not an all-time great fighter, but I just don't know if he quite has the resume of some of the other fighters out there. Like I said, Andre Ward, he's kind of on like that Salvador Sanchez, Bernard Hopkins level when it comes down to, or Joe Calzaghe level. In my opinion, Bernard Hopkins, he probably is even going to be behind that of a Bernard Hopkins, because Bernard Hopkins is in that Miguel Cotto, Oscar De La Hoya, Sugar Shane Mosley level. When I take a look overall at Andre Ward and Joe Calzaghe, they're probably in that same conversation with that of a Salvador Sanchez. Miguel Cotto, Shane Mosley, and Oscar De La Hoya and Bernard Hopkins, they're kind of in that top 40, top 50 range. Maybe, like 35 at the highest, some of those guys. But when it comes down to, when it comes down to Joe Calzaghe, Andre Ward, they're probably in my top 25 to top 30.
Bottom 10, but I can definitely tell you there are at least 10 other fighters that won the most important fights of their career.
So name them. Who are they specifically? Go ahead and name them. Name them off the top of your head. Who specifically? Name 10 fighters that are above Manny Pacquiao. I can't do it. It's not pronounced Sweet Pea Whitaker. It's certainly not Bernard Hopkins. It just is what it is.
And Manny Pacquiao is not one of them, at least not one to do it consistently. Once again, he got the win over Barrera. He got the win over Morales, right? And when it comes to like a lot of his other wins, like wins,
he also got a win over Marquez and Cotto, and he also got a win over several other great fighters. Keith Thurman, and he was 41 damn years old. No, Manny Pacquiao is the top 10 boxer of all time, undoubtedly.
Over Shane Mosley, Ricky Hatton, Margarito, and all of these guys, just like Canelo's situation, the majority of those guys were coming off of recent losses or knockout losses, right? So while those were good wins,
I don't know how you're going to make that point with Canelo. Canelo has fought so many top-ranked guys. Like I said, now Manny Pacquiao, saying that with Manny Pacquiao, that's a little bit more understandable. Because Manny Pacquiao, when it comes down to, when he fought Sugar Shane Mosley, he was coming off of a loss. When he fought Ricky Hatton, some would debate that he was mentally done overall after he lost to Floyd Mayweather Jr. by knockout. So I don't necessarily have a problem with that. But if you're going to make it with Canelo, that just doesn't make any sense. Who did he fight as of recent that was really coming off of a knockout loss? That was an A-grade fighter. It wasn't Billy Joe Saunders. It wasn't Callum Smith. It wasn't Caleb Plant. It wasn't Danny Jacobs. Now the stupid point that they tried to make overall about that is that, oh, well, Danny Jacobs, he was already knocked out in his career. Yeah, like several years earlier, you dingbat. It's like, what? Why would you even try to make that point? That's like me saying, Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s win over Manny Pacquiao, that's not really that great of a win because Manny Pacquiao overall several years earlier against Juan Manuel Marquez suffered a knockout loss. Does that make any sense? Like, come on.
Weren't as impressive as Manny Pacquiao once again beating a Barrera or a Morales. Because those guys at the time, they weren't coming off of being knocked out. They were in their prime when Manny Pacquiao beat them. Okay, so now we move...
So was Cotto, so was Marquez.
Move on to Carlos Monzon. Now, guys, let me just make this clear. I noticed this pattern. Every single time, old media, they do the right thing by putting the right guy at the number one spot. They always make sure they put some ridiculous names right below his name. They did this when they rated Floyd Mayweather as the greatest fighter in the last 25 years. It's almost as if they feel that as long as they put Floyd Mayweather's name at number one, they can sneak in whatever name they want undetected. Nobody will really notice it. That ain't happening. Once again, man, do you know how disrespectful it is? Everyone has been calling Sugar Ray Robinson the greatest fighter of all time. And out of nowhere, you decide to just put Carlos Monzon above him? God.
Carlos Monzon was an all-time great fighter. For those of you overall that don't know a lot about him, he's probably the greatest Argentine fighter. And Argentine fighters, the Argentina, they don't really have as big of a history, of course, in boxing as Puerto Rico or Mexico or maybe even some other countries out there. But they still have came out with some really great fighters like Marcos Maidana, Lucas Matisse, Sergio Martinez. Those are some of the Argentinian fighters of today. Carlos Monzon was a middleweight that defended his title several times. Carlos Monzon, in my opinion, he has to debatably be in the top 10 because he did defeat, I believe, some decent names for the day, even though I can't really come up with them off the top of my head. But if you take a look at his resume, it's not bad. And on top of that, he was able to defeat everyone that he ever faced.
You know how you always hear these race fans use these code words whenever a black fighter is chasing a Latino fighter or someone who's not black? What do they always say? To protect the guy who's running, these race fans, they always use these code words. Well, who did he fight? Who did the black guy fight, right? Like implying that they don't want the black fighter to get his hands on that guy because he ain't fought nobody, right? At least this is what they always say. They always ask this question. The funny thing is, that question should not apply when the guy who's chasing him wants to fight him. You should only be asking a question like that in a case like this, where we're talking about fighters that are perceived as the greatest of all time or top 10, one of the greatest, whatever the case. That's when you ask the question, who has he fought? Who has he beat?
I would agree with that.
You don't say that when there's a guy out there that wants all the smoke. Because if these guys stop ducking, then we will know who he beat. I mean, just imagine one of these boxers chasing another boxer down the street.
But Dante, of course, is going to make the point basically about who did Carlos Monzon beat, and I don't think that he's really going to make the best of points. What I'll say about Carlos Monzon is this. I don't know necessarily where I would rank him, but he'd be in that top 10, top 15 pound for pound of all time, in my opinion, at least certainly within my top 20. What I'll say is this. I would put Carlos Monzon certainly above that of a Joe Louis. You know, it is what it is.
This man running for his life, and he turning around, looking at the dude who's chasing him, and he says, who have you beat?
And some people may ask, really, why would you put him above Joe Louis? Because Joe Louis, if you really want to talk about a person that actually lost the bigger fights of his career, I mean, besides beating the heavyweights that, you know, really were not looked at as the most talented of the day. I mean, don't get me wrong, he beat some very talented heavyweights. But like I said, not only did you lose the Rocky Marciano fight, you lost the Max Smelling fight when it came down to it. And on top of that, you also lost, I believe, to Ezra Charles or Jersey Joe Walcott, one of those guys. So Joe Louis can never be remembered as the best of his day, in my opinion. Just can't.
While he running his ass off. Does that make any sense? Of course not. So when it comes to Carlos Monzon, who did he beat? Where are the Manny Pacquiao names? Where are the Canelo Alvarez names? Where are the Haglers, the Hearns, the Sugar Ray Leonards, the Fraziers? Where are those names on this man's record? They are not there. If you look up Carlos Monzon's record, you'll see a whole bunch of fighters with like 22 losses, 30 losses, 15 losses.
There's some fighters overall that have around those losses, but there's also a lot of fighters that have very decent records. And on top of that, Carlos Monzon was in the generation to where you fought like over 100 plus fights. That was the generation that he was in. Because if you notice his resume, he has like 100 fights on his resume. He had like 87 wins, 3 losses, I believe, and 9 draws. So he was just in that generation.
Just go to BoxRec right now and look up Carlos Monzon's record. Look at his opponents. Who did this man beat? See, people want to praise him because he held the middleweight title for so long and he had all these title defenses. But title defenses against who? He never.
I would agree with you, Dante, but why did you not have the same energy with Deontay Wilder? Like I said, these guys always try to discredit. This is why it's very important to have logic and objectivity, because you have to take a look at things in context. But Carlos Monzon, in my opinion, was a very decently great fighter for his day. But then they'll take a look at Deontay Wilder, or they'll take a look at Joe Louis or someone like that, and they'll say, wow, can you believe how many times they defended their title? They didn't defend their title against anyone. It's just, it is what it is.
Defended against Marvin Hagler. And I'm not saying that he was supposed to at the time. I'm not saying he ducked him. But
because they weren't really a part of the same generation.
Once again, he does not have the names on his record. You could defend the title 100 times.
Now, would I necessarily put him over Sugar Ray Robinson? No, but he defeated the best guys of his day.
If you're not fighting anyone, it doesn't really mean a whole lot.
I would agree, Dante. So why this whole entire time were these channels always bucking up Deontay Wilder's 10 title defenses? You remember that shit? You remember when Deontay Wilder had those 10 worthless-ass title defenses, unless we're talking about Luis Ortiz, and it's kind of the same thing with Gennady Golovkin, in my opinion, unless we're talking about Danny Jacobs or David Lemieux. But when it comes down to you remember how so many of these guys, they try to call Gennady Golovkin a hype job, but then when it comes to Deontay Wilder or Joe Louis or some shit like that, they always try to hype his ass up. It just is what it is. Now, don't get me wrong. They're all great fighters in their own right. I'm not trying to disrespect anybody, but like I said, you need context.
I keep talking about the important wins that you get in your career. And what are the important wins that Carlos Monzon got? It's not his fault, but Carlos Monzon, he didn't get any of the big names in the ring. So it's ridiculous to say that this man is top 3, the greatest fighter of all time over
I don't know if I would say that he's top 3, but he'd be within my top 10, top 15.
Sugar Ray Robinson and Muhammad Ali, and the list goes on and on and on. It makes no sense. Like I said, when it comes to Floyd Mayweather, I can tell you right now, there are a lot of people that Floyd Mayweather beat that would most likely beat a lot of these other fighters that are on this pound-for-pound greatest of all time list. For sure. You put them in the same weight class, same division, I'm not going to say Carlos Monzon would lose to all of them, but he wouldn't beat them all, that's for sure.
Well, I don't know, but like I said, you can't necessarily compare it like that because the eras are different. So, like I said, the skill sets have improved massively from what they were, even just 20 years ago. So, it is what it is. That's why I have to take a look at for the day, all in all, how great were they for their day? Now, of course, someone, in my opinion, who doesn't have the greatest of resumes, they can't really be above someone that has an all-time great resume. That's why I can't necessarily put Salvador Sanchez on the same level, in my opinion, as some of the other, ones, because he just didn't, have quite the record or accomplishments of some of the other ones that I've seen. But he was an all-time great fighter, no doubt about it.
It's not about how many wins you get. It's not about how many times you defend your title. It's about who you beat. That's what it really comes down to at the end of the day. Now, when you
I would somewhat agree with you, Dante, but I think it's about all of it. But Carlos Monzon, he beat the names that he needed to in the middleweight division.
combine who you beat with the impressive record, that's when that record means something. But not if you don't have the names to go with the record. So at the end of the day, that is a huge statement for a website like BoxRec, because they're one of the most biased websites in boxing. For them to admit that Floyd Mayweather is the greatest of all time, that's huge. So with that being said, I'm going to wrap this video up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
And that's pretty much all I got for this video as well. But I just thought that was very interesting. But anyways, Mr. Manny Pacquiao, in my opinion, just to reminisce his career, I do have to have him in my top 10 pound for pound of all time. I don't know 10 fighters off the top of my head that, in my opinion, would be over Manny Pacquiao. I just can't name them. It is what it is. But anyways, that's really about it for this video today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.